and gentlemen, I'm a non-hotelier, married to a hotelier, so can't escape hospitality. As you can see, it is an integral part of my life now. I'm Payal Gandhi Hoon, and it's my honor and pleasure to weave this day for you. By now, you've familiarized yourselves with the Conclave agenda for the day, but I'd like to share some noteworthy points for you to make this an immersive experience for yourselves. For starters, today you stand a chance to win hotel stay vouchers in our sweepstakes section. It's time to practice the power of manifestation, so stay tuned for more details. Now that I've got your attention, let me also garnish this experience further with a mention of some gastronomical and libations indulgences. So we do have 2 breaks during the day, a lunch break and an afternoon tea coffee break. And also, of course, on to business. In the event that your curiosity has piqued after listening to our distinguished panelists, you may get an opportunity for 2 to 3 minutes for a Q&A round, post-panel discussion. And also, to check into the real world, please check out of your digital world. Please put your phones on silent and practice the power of now by listening into real-time speakers. On that note, enjoy the GHC experience, pulsating with leadership ideas, discussions, also personal and business stories that each speaker is here to share with you in person. So on to the first panel of the day. Is an incisive discussion about the extremely volatile geopolitical graph of the world and India's stance to this evolving global dynamics. Please note that this panel is under the Chatham House rules, so that means that you can listen into it but not really make videos of it and also identify the sources of the speakers here. So I would like to introduce the panel, which is India's strategic options in the prevailing scenario. And on that note, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists, Mr. Arun Singh, former ambassador of India to the United States, France, and Israel. Through his distinguished 37-year career in the Indian Foreign Services, Ambassador Singh has been instrumental in shaping India's policies, strengthening US-India relationship, and building closer ties with Israel. He was pivotal in formulation and implementation of India's policies related to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, including in the period following 9/11. A former member of India's National Security Advisory Board, currently he is a senior counselor at the Cohen Group, a visiting professor at Ashoka University, and a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India. And then we have the other panelist, Ms. Indrani Bagchi, CEO, Ananta Center and Foreign Policy Commentator, former associate editor with the Times of India, where she reported and analyzed foreign policy issues. She has worked with India Today, the Economic Times, and the Statesman. As a diplomatic editor, Indrani covered the Ministry of External Affairs, a Reuters Fellow at Oxford University, and Kamal Nayan Bajaj, a fellow member. The Aspen Leadership Network, Indrani has been awarded the Chang Lin Tien Fellowship by Asia Foundation. And I'd like to also invite Professor Harshvi Pant, Vice President Studies and Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, Professor of International Relations with King's India Institute at King's College London, Director Honorary of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs at Delhi University, a visiting professor and a scholar at several prominent and acclaimed institutions in India and overseas. Professor Pant's recent research is focused on Asian security issues. His recent books include India and the Global Governance, A Rising Power and Its Discontents, and Politics and Geopolitics, Decoding India's Neighborhood Challenge. The panel, ladies and gentlemen, is being moderated by Vice Admiral Anil Chopra, a former Navy Commander-in-Chief and commentator on military and strategic affairs. He has the unique distinction of being the Commander-in-Chief of both combat commands of the Indian Navy, Western Naval Command, and the Eastern Naval Command, of being the Director General of the Indian Coast Guard for 3 years in the immediate aftermath of 2008 Mumbai terror attacks. At sea, Admiral Chopra commanded the Western Fleet, the Navy's main offensive strike force, presently deployed in the Arabian Sea. He also commanded the aircraft carrier INS Virat, the destroyer INS Rajput, the missile corvette INS Kutar. After his active service, Admiral Chopra was a member of the National Security Advisory Board, which provides inputs on multifarious security issues to the Apex National Security Council. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, can we give them a big round of applause and invite them to the stage? Over to you, Admiral.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what I'm sure will be an interesting session on India's predicaments and strategic choices in a rapidly changing global and regional environment. This audience would be more than cognizant of the fact that a nation's strategic situation has considerable impact on business and industry, and hospitality and tourism in particular. Hopefully, the audience is in combative mood after Sindoor, and doubtless there are many budding strategists in the hall today eager to debate the issue, as Indians must actually increasingly do. Initially, our session was programmed to focus on the likely impact of Trump 2.0 on India's security and prosperity. But clearly, the recent armed conflict with Pakistan has greater salience on India's strategic chessboard and has seen a paradigm shift in New Delhi's stance with respect to both terror and nuclear blackmail. Given the events of the last fortnight, we have therefore requested our eminent panelists to factor in Operation Sindoor, whose fallout could well impact many of our relationships, particularly with the United States, with whom we are actively engaged in progressing increased military cooperation and a bilateral trade agreement. India, like everyone else mostly, seeks strategic autonomy as befitting a nation of its size and potential. But not even the most powerful nations can operate in splendid isolation. Cooperation, alignments, adversaries are part and parcel of the Westphalian order of competitive nation states currently holding sway on this planet. Let me just very briefly outline the strategic conundrum before I hand over to the panelists. There is no gainsaying that President Trump is literally refashioning the international order in significant ways, in particular the global trading regime. Prior to Sindoor, Indo-US ties had acquired great momentum. Both countries have been actively engaged in fashioning the bilateral trade agreement and a new 15-year-old framework on defense cooperation in time for them to be ratified during President Trump's scheduled visit to India later this year for the Quad Leaders Summit. The joint statement released after Prime Minister Modi's meeting with President Trump in the White House in February was perhaps one of the most detailed and ambitious documents ever articulated in the history of Indo-US relations, aiming to increase bilateral trade to $500 billion by 2030. It now remains to be seen if the fallout of Sindoor arrests this momentum to any degree. China. It would be apparent to all discerning observers that China remains a major threat and a clear and present danger to India in more ways than one. The Middle Kingdom, historically inclined to suzerainty over its entire periphery, is unlikely to accept a peer competitor in Asia and will use every opportunity to weaken India economically and militarily and fashion a Sino-centric Asia. There are still some who believe in Pan-Asian solidarity and push for better relationship with China, but the reality on the ground is far removed from such idealism, despite the economic interaction. The all-weather relationship between Islamabad and Beijing is an unpleasant fact, and India faces the prospect, as always, of hostilities on two fronts, with Bangladesh now adding to the strategic mix. Russia. India's ties with Moscow are rooted in long friendship, but in sentimentality and emotionalism, which often tends to ignore the reality of current Russian capabilities, as also its own constraints and compulsions. Mired in its own war in Ukraine, Moscow can no longer majorly support India's military requirements and is neither in a position to invest heavily in India's economy. One cannot also ignore the deepening ties between China and Russia, the so-called Pact of Steel, as again underscored in the recent Victory Day parade in Moscow, particularly since Russia is the junior partner. In sum, there are no easy choices for New Delhi, especially since India's defense industrial base has not yet adequately developed for the country to be completely self-sufficient in military wherewithal. And India's economy still needs considerable investment and vibrant interaction with the developed economies of the world. India's ties with the UK and EU are also significant in this regard. I will stop here and request Indrani to lead the fray and speak her mind regarding India's strategic choices from wherever you might want to.
Thank you all, and thank you very much for inviting me here this morning. This is obviously one of my favorite things to do on a Saturday morning, is to talk about something I love. India actually exercised a strategic choice on the 7th of May. That strategic choice was to target and hit terror infrastructure inside Pakistan. This has been literally a dream for the last 25, almost 30 years that I have followed this particular relationship. And Ambassador Singh here, who helmed a lot of the India-Pakistan relationship during some very, very difficult years. We used to say to each other, you know, when can we not hit Muridke, the headquarters of the Lashkar, after every successive LET terror attack? And for those who don't remember, it was not merely the Mumbai attacks of 2008, but remember the pressure cooker bombs that went off in Mumbai's trains in 2005, attacks in Delhi, Jaipur, you have it, and of course Kashmir. In the past 12 to 15 years, I think one of the things that we've developed is, or at least we determined, is to develop the capability of being able to strike further and better with greater precision, but also a strategic determination, and that was this, that a terror attack of the magnitude that you saw in Mumbai or in Pahalgam, for instance, required a military response, that it was an act of war and had to be responded to as an act of war. To that end, I think governments in India tried to marry the development of military capability to this particular strategic aim. If you notice in various, at various points over the last say 10 years, either in 2016 when troops went over, crossed over the line of control to hit terror camps, or in 2019 or in 2025, each successive strike has been more precise, more sophisticated, more far-reaching. However, having said that, and Operation Sindoor, now that the dust is settling and the disinformation campaigns from everywhere, this has been a war of disinformation as much as it has been a war of missiles and air defenses. I think there are certain things that we can say with greater certainty. One, that the military acquitted itself fairly creditably. Second, we have redefined yet again our response to Pakistan sponsored terror, not merely with the military strikes, but also I think by weaponizing water, by holding the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance. India has indicated that it will use the supply of water to drive compellence inside Pakistan. How successful will India be? How successful will the move be inside Pakistan? We have to watch. The other part of the strategic sort of chessboard that you noticed was that America, from saying that this war is none of our business and we just have to want to stay out of this war, to within 36 hours the President of the US actually going on social media to announce the ceasefire between India and Pakistan before India or Pakistan could actually say it, is extraordinary and brings in a whole new dimension to this particular regional conflict. Among other things, it breached a number of red lines that people like Ambassador Singh have imposed quite strictly on the rest of the world forever. Mostly that India Pakistan would be a bilateral issue, not a multilateral issue. President Trump, even this morning in an interview to Brett Baer, has been congratulating himself for stopping a nuclear war and has promised to start trading with both Pakistan and India. The Commerce Minister will be, our Commerce Minister will be in the US in the next couple of days for the next round of negotiations on the bilateral trade agreement, but we will have to see how that proceeds. I think the first sign of displeasure by the Indian government after this, after the presidential announcement, was to not only refute a US president on record by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, but also I think India, once the tariffs were imposed by President Trump earlier in the year, India refrained from taking any retaliatory action. The first retaliatory action came on the 11th of May. And so I think we will have to see how this relationship moves, because the US, for everything else, is actually one of India's, probably India's most important strategic partner. Has been for the last quarter of a century and will continue to be no matter what happens. There is the small matter of how do you work with a president who is as mercurial as President Trump. But here India is not alone. I think every country in the world, friend or foe, is dealing with this unpredictability as well. President Trump has actually coined a new word for himself, where he is calling himself the architect of global commercial diplomacy, which could either be about imposing tariffs on other countries, or turning them around really swiftly to do a deal. And we will see various versions, kinds of these deals coming up as we go along. India started out the second Trump administration believing that because the first Trump administration went fairly smoothly where India was concerned, that there was a way we kind of understood how this gentleman would work and we would be able to work with him. Given that he has, his comments have breached so many of India's long held principles about the regional situation, I think a certain level of education will be necessary from the Indian government to the US administration. The imponderables in this are how does China, where does China fit in and how does that work? So from a place where President Trump imposed about 245% tariffs on China, bilaterally there were 245%, there has been an almost 180-degree shift, and we are back to minimum levels of tariffs with the Chinese, waiting for the grand deal, and we had no idea what the grand deal is going to be like. How does President Trump play the game with President Xi Jinping, who is comes from a long history of statecraft? We will have to watch that in as it unfolds. In fact, for India and for the rest of the world, one of the ways, I mean, a sort of example of how swiftly the world has changed has been that in the last 6 months, I mean 6 months ago, the world was talking about the return of geopolitics and how you make strategic choices. Your strategic choices determine your trading choices, your economic choices and your technology choices. And vice versa, your technology choices also determined your strategic choices. Today, President Trump has rewritten that little bit of global strategy to say, I trade and I impose tariffs and we make different technology choices and we make different strategic choices. So, for many countries, and here frankly I would include America as well, everybody is struggling. So, we are in a unique space in the world where the world is changing in a way which we do not know where the next missile is going to come from, and how we believed that we knew even 6 months ago, we believed we knew how the world was changing, and we could fairly predict that this is how it would move. Today we do not know. We know for a fact that President Trump's way of dealing with, say, China, which is the US's biggest strategic competitor, may not be exactly the way his advisors, his closest cabinet members are looking at China, because they are looking at China as a country from where they need to decouple. President Trump is not talking about decoupling. So, everybody is rewriting the rules of the game as we go along. I think we should all be prepared for a fairly rough ride, and hold on to your seats, because this is going to get rougher as we go along. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Indrani. Thank you for that. And I think we'll follow up with Professor Pant. We'll hear you and Arun then later, and then we'll have a chat. Please.
Thank you, Admiral Chopra, and thank you, Oberoi Group, for having me part of this very interesting discussion, and of course an entire day of hospitality. Indrani has laid out almost a very panoramic view of what is in store for us, and I'm sure Ambassador Singh would go into the specifics of some of our relationships, and perhaps particularly in Pakistan. I thought I would start slightly, given that I am an academic, give it a more of an academic tilt, just looking at some of the broad trends perhaps, and where India's strategic choices might be positioned. It was fairly interesting that last week, if you were reading Indian newspapers and also global media coverage, it was very striking that there were two news stories that were being juxtaposed. One was India signing trade agreement with the UK. And this came as a surprise, because this is one of the first early trade agreements that India has done with a big economy. And of course, the pause in US-China trade war. And on the other hand, the Pakistan situation exploded. So you had this juxtaposition, I think, of these two news stories, which also tell you a story about India and where India is positioned at this point. That India is desperately trying to get out of the straitjacket of South Asia, of Pakistan, the monkey on your shoulder. You want to get rid of that, and you're making a mark as a global economy, global power, rising power, emerging power, whatever the term you may want to use. And yet you have the perennial problem of history, perennial problem of geography that keeps dragging you down. And I think this juxtaposition is interesting and important to think through some of the strategic choices that India has made, and probably will have to make as India moves forward. And India is doing, or will have to do this in the context of some of the interesting developments, broad trends that we see in the world today. One, and I think almost all of them were alluded to by Indrani. One of them, of course, is we live in an age where we don't know what kind of a balance of power is going to emerge. We knew it in the 1990s that Cold War ended, the unipolar moment of America had begun, but right now we don't know whether this is going to, America may retain its unipolar edge, whether we are going to see a bipolar rapprochement between US and China, and some kind of a global condominium between two big powers emerge, or whether this is going to be a multipolar world, which many of our policymakers prefer and of course privilege over others, because it gives India a voice. So I think in that sense, the larger geometry of global politics is up in the air. We don't really know what might happen, but we are looking at this flux in the system. We are looking at how powers are rising, how they are falling, and as a result of which, how much turbulence is there in the system. Institutions are not working. Institutions that were created post-Second World War are no longer relevant. Most of the time you see them from WTO to WHO, almost all of them redundant. The norms that were created for a particular period in time are no longer relevant to a time when other powers, emerging powers, are challenging those norms. And in some ways, fundamental rethink is happening on some of the assumptions that were made as late as 1990s, and that is the global economic order. We believed at that point in time that greater economic interdependence is going to result in greater political engagement, perhaps a more stable political relationship. If you trade more, we were told, you become friends with each other. Today you are realizing that that's not really how it worked for most states. And greater economic interdependence, in fact, is leading to greater vulnerability, a sense of vulnerability, a sense of challenge in how you manage your political relationship. So you're looking at an entire tapestry of issues on the economic side, which are being redefined even as we speak. So in a sense, we live in a world where everything is getting weaponized, weaponization of everything, as it has been said. You know, we are weaponizing trade, we are weaponizing technology, we are weaponizing supply chains and critical minerals. So you look at the world and you see how major players are looking at the economic dynamic, how economic nationalism is the new norm. Countries that were the biggest votaries of economic globalization in the US and Europe are now turning inwards, and as a result you have countries which are emerging also looking at their economic choices, including India, in a very different manner in which perhaps it was looked at one point in time. So in that sense, India's emergence at a time when there is wider leadership void makes India's voice more critical and perhaps more relevant in the way India will need to project itself, and India will need to situate its own role in global politics. And I think in that context I want to come to Pakistan, because I think thinking big is important. Now Pakistan, you know, of course there has been a war with Pakistan, and we are, we have performed well. Indrani laid out what exactly I think the dynamic emerged. We were able to emerge out of our constraints that were imposed in the post-1998 nuclear order, which Pakistan kept on playing to, that look, we are both nuclear powers, so therefore India does not have very many options apart from absorbing many of the costs. And I think over the last decade, we have seen India crossing those red lines, India emerging as a country that can shape, that can take certain risks, and by manipulating the risks can shape the behavior of Pakistan under the nuclear umbrella, which is a big change. Very few, and I think no two nuclear powers have actually engaged with each other the way India has with Pakistan and shaped Pakistan's calculus. So we are in a very interesting phase of India trying to change the calculus for Pakistan and for itself in South Asia. But I would just, underscore the larger point that I think we need to go back to this argument that ultimately Pakistan is not India's strategic challenge. Pakistan will remain a nuisance, Pakistan will remain a problem, but Pakistan, if we get too obsessed with Pakistan, we are also in the danger of making wrong strategic choices. Because ultimately, the bigger challenge, the strategic challenge, and I think I think Admiral Luthra started off by saying China is the big question facing India. Not only India, facing the global order. So in that sense, India's priorities should be very, very clear. That while we revel in the fact that we have taken on Pakistan, we have given Pakistan a befitting reply, if the focus turns back to Pakistan, I think that will be a great disservice to the larger foreign policy and national security arc that India has witnessed over the last decade, where we have tried to emerge out of this hyphenation with Pakistan. And this is as much driven by what others do to us, like for example, Mr. Trump telling us that, no, I'm going to solve this problem, I'm going to hyphenate, and suddenly everyone is talking about hyphenation with Pakistan. But I think this is also in our minds. This is also about us thinking where we belong to. If we continue to look at Pakistan as the biggest problem, Pakistan is the most important problem, then I think we hyphenate ourselves with a country that we should not be doing, and that doesn't deserve to be and is not clearly in the same rank as India. India's trajectory, India's global profile, India's global achievements, and India's larger voice on the global system is today entirely different from what Pakistan represents. So I think a lot of the times the challenge for us is also to look at some of these conflicts, to look at our challenge with Pakistan through a lens which befits India's global stature, which is a stature which is about shaping global norms, shaping global outcomes, rather than being shaped by what others tell us to do. And that had been a big shift in India's approach to global politics over the last few years. And I think that should continue, because nothing suits China better than an India that is boxed in South Asia, an India that is boxed in with Pakistan, an India that does not keep its eyes on the big strategic objective that India should have, which is economic growth, economic growth, economic growth. That is the biggest answer to Pakistan. India has to become economically so powerful, and what we have done in the last few decades, that Pakistan becomes automatically irrelevant for us and for others. Because otherwise, our problem is that our media, our chatterati, our people, academia, all of us get this adrenaline flowing because of Pakistan. And I think that does a great disservice to the larger arc of Indian foreign policy, which should have its eyes set much higher than what it is. And I think that is the opportunity that we have today. And the opportunity is because we live in a world where a lot is changing. And when a lot changes, a voice that can clearly articulate the needs of the world, that can clearly articulate a solution to the problems, a voice that can articulate what perhaps it can contribute to the global order, that voice gets much traction. And I think this is the moment for India as a rising economic power, as a country with its own demographic dividend, as a country that is growing up in so many parameters, to redefine our own priorities in a way that sinks more broadly with not the Pakistan question, but the broader question of the global order. And I think we should be talking about that, and that's where India's strategic choices should lie, and eventually should shape the global order. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Arun?
Thanks, Anil.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anil. So based on what Indrani and Harsh have said, taking off from the point where he laid out, clearly the main global contestation today is between US, Russia and China. And everybody is working their way around that. US sees Russia as a military challenge. US sees Russia as a military challenge, but not an economic or technological challenge. And US says that the main economic, technological and military challenge today is China, and that China is the only country with the intent and capability to replace the US in the international system. Now, given that, how does India position itself? So for us, China is going to remain an adversary. And people who are continue to deal with China, including in track 2 dialogues, the message they bring back is that China doesn't see any need to accommodate India or India's concerns. They see that India is not on the same level as China and should accept its position as subservient to China, and obviously India is not going to do that. So given that, the next challenge would be, how do we define our relationship with Russia? And Russia is a very important partner for India. It has given us political support in the 50s, 60s, at a time when that support was not available elsewhere, where the West treated us as an adversary. It gave us military supplies when it was not available from the West. It gave us defense and some other technologies that were not available elsewhere and at competitive prices. But still, on some issues, the Soviet Union or Russia was not quite where we would have wanted them. Now, if you look at the 1962 conflict with China, the Soviet Union, because of its relationship with Communist China, was not supportive of India at that time. And it was the United States, despite its difficulties with India, in the China context, came forward and was much more supportive. And now, in fact, it's in the public domain that the Indian Prime Minister then had written a letter to President Kennedy asking for aircraft and American pilots to fly those aircraft during the 1962 conflict, because our situation was difficult. But of course, Chinese declared ceasefire, withdrew, so that was not required. And similarly, after 1971, where the Russians, Soviet Union was very supportive of India during the 1971 conflict. But once the conflict was over, then they were pressurizing India to do a deal with Pakistan, and that bring the conflict to an end, do some kind of a deal with Pakistan, don't move into the Western Front. So they were looking at their broader interests. So we have to understand that each country pursues its own interests. So today, India would be watching closely that the new Russia, with which we have a good relationship and gives us certain technology, for example, nuclear propulsion for submarines, which nobody else was prepared to give, what is the kind of relationship it is building with China. And one part of India's effort would be to prevent Russia from going over to China, at least on India-China issues. But some uncertainty will be in the minds of Indian policymakers that at a moment of crisis, given Russia's increasing dependence on China, as it has been alienated from US and Europe, at that moment of crisis, will Russia be as supportive of India as it has been in the past? So far it has been, but that element of uncertainty will always be in the policymaker's mind. So the third leg of this triangle is the United States. What do you do with the United States? Now, Indrani mentioned that is still, despite all the challenges, in many ways a very, very important, perhaps the most important partner, because Russia is our most important military partner still. But if you look at India's comprehensive national interest, clearly the US is India's most important partner. It's our largest trading partner at $200 billion. This trade has increased by 15 times in the last 20 years. US is the largest foreign investor in India. Indian companies have invested more than $40 billion in the US economy and have a presence across all 50 states in the United States. Obviously, for market access or technology access, they see advantage to themselves from there. At 5.2 million, US is the largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora. And of course, they have links here. And now they are becoming an integral part of US society. The former vice president was a person of Indian origin, the spouse of the current vice president, person of Indian origin. You look at CEOs of companies, so many of them, Microsoft, Google, Adobe, IBM, these are persons of Indian origin, 6 elected members in the US Congress. So deep integration of Indian origin population in US society, which could be a challenge, but could also be a leverage point. At 300,000 Indian students in US universities, and these are not Indian origin students, these are Indian students whose families are here. Again, the largest single country presence of Indian students. We spend $9 billion annually just on tuition fees for those students. Then there is the other expenditure. But they gain from that. Some stay on to work, some come back, build businesses based on the understanding and networks that they've developed. So US remains an important partner. But how do you deal with a partner which has a very complicated governance structure? Because every 4 years, 8 years, the government changes. Governments come with new set of priorities. The new leader will have new set of priorities, and you have to work your way around that. Today, the situation is somewhat different for a while, but normally the US president is not all powerful. He has certain powers, but the Congress has a lot of power. The regions have power, businesses have power, think tanks have influence. So any government has to work with all these entities, and you can get a hit from anywhere. I remember in 2012-13, when India was making an attempt to increase localization of production in the telecom sector. We came under immense pressure from US Congress at that time, because there was criticism on US Congress that your localization of production is telecom is impacting negatively US business. Now, it was a very strange case. The US business being impacted, which was making a lot of noise against India, was IBM. But IBM was not doing any production in the US. They were importing from China into India, and they were a managed service provider, and the beneficiary was the US shareholder. So US shareholder interest was campaigning against India with US Congress for imports from China, and it was generating certain negative sentiment related to India. So it's a very complex structure that you have to deal with. The second thing we have to also recall is that the India-US relationship has strengthened tremendously in the last 25 years. In 1998, US had imposed huge sanctions on India after we did our nuclear tests. The relationship started changing with Bill Clinton's visit to India in 2000. After that, with each president, Republican and Democratic, the relationship has only consolidated at an accelerating trend. But with each president, we've had difficulties. President Bush with Dr. Manmohan Singh did the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement with India. It was a path-breaking agreement, because without that agreement, US could not do high technology partnerships with India. There was opposition in the US, there was opposition in India, there was a no confidence motion against the Indian Prime Minister, and he had to sustain that to continue with this agreement. But even as he was doing this agreement, as a result of which in September 2008, for example, when the Indian Prime Minister visited the US, met President Bush, and at that time you may recall that President Bush was extremely unpopular in the United States. His support rating was about 26% because of the war in Iraq. And September 2008, the Indian Prime Minister meets the US President and said, the people of India deeply love you. Because the impact he had because of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement and the technology releases that start. But even as he did that, just a couple of years before that, he invited President Musharraf to Camp David, and standing next to Musharraf, he said, here is a man who is standing tight with the United States. At a time when Musharraf had done Kargil, Musharraf had done terrorism against India, it was sort of under his watch that, that the December 2001 attack on Indian Parliament had taken place. So, US was looking at its own interest. After that, we had President Obama, who continued with the trajectory set by President Bush, declared India a major defense partner, visited India twice in his tenure. No US president had done that. Came as chief guest on Republic Day. No US president had done that earlier. Declared support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council. And still in February 2016, out of nowhere, he announced that US was going to give 18 F-16 aircraft to Pakistan. And we know that Pakistan uses F-16s only against India. And they cited the justification of Afghanistan, but the reason was that the US at that time wanted support from Pakistan to get some dialogue going with the Taliban. And therefore, to incentivize Pakistan, they offered that. Of course, at that time, because of certain mood in the US Congress, we were able to lobby the US Congress and prevent the sale of F-16s to Pakistan. So, again, this is one way to indicate how you can leverage different parts of the US system to pursue your interests, even if the administration takes a decision which is not in keeping with India's interest. After that, we had President Trump, and he, good relationship with Indian Prime Minister, went to the Howdy Modi event in Houston. Very unusual for a sitting US president to go to an event for a visiting foreign leader. And he spoke there, he stayed there right through the event. At the end of the event, the two went around the stadium holding hands. Soon after that, he invited Imran Khan to the White House, because at that time he wanted to get Pakistan's support to get some agreement going with the Taliban. And he tells Imran Khan in the White House, very similar to what he has done now, that I'm ready to mediate on Kashmir. And not only that, he said that the Indian Prime Minister has asked me to mediate on Kashmir. Now, simply couldn't be true. So, he was the president of a major country, not conditioned by facts in his articulation of position or policy. And you just have to deal with that. And then after that, we had President Biden. Again, advanced the relationship tremendously by doing the agreement with India for a partnership on critical and emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum, cyber, 6G, biotech, semiconductors, defense, space, and in all these areas, there was huge progress. 6 US companies came forward, invested in India's semiconductors. US authorized 80% technology transfer for the GE414 engines to India. And they said that that level of technology transfer they have not authorized to any other country, including even the NATO partners of the United States. So, these were some of the positive areas, and yet there was concern in India because of the position US took related to allegations of involvement of an Indian official in targeting of Pannu in the United States, or perceptions in India related to US role in the changes that have taken place in Bangladesh, which had been adversarial from India's security interest point of view. And so, now with that background, we have a government in the United States, which in many ways is very unique. It is trying to overturn many of the norms and standards in the US that have developed since the 1960s. And I'll just cite some examples. For example, so far they are very restrictive on any refugees or asylum seekers coming into the US. But suddenly they have made an exception for white South African farmers to be allowed to come. Now, what does that indicate? US for a long time was supportive of efforts at decolonization, but now he's talking about taking back Panama Canal, or wanting to take over Greenland, or talking about Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States. If you see the joint statement that was issued when the Prime Minister went in February, for the first time in almost 20 years that I've handled India-US relations, for the first time there is no reference to climate change in that joint statement, because the US doesn't want to talk about climate change. The US for a long time promoted DEI policies. Now you cannot say DEI. And not only the government is forcing businesses and universities to take away any references from DEI policies. Of course, many of them sustaining it by saying they need diverse inputs into their decision making, but nobody wants to use DEI. And you see the steps being taken in universities, law firms, etc. So given all this, as far as India is concerned, the couple of things that are important are issues related to tariffs and issues related to security. Now, on tariffs, from what has come out, the two countries engaged in very serious discussions on a multi-sectoral free trade agreement. Our Commerce Minister was there, he's going there again. Assistant USTR was here. Then the lead negotiator from India had gone. They had very detailed sectoral discussions. So there is an expectation that by the fall of this year, that the first tranche of a multi-sectoral free trade agreement would be worked out. Now, if that is done, perhaps the kind of reciprocal tariffs that he's been talking about would not be imposed on India. There is also a possibility that part 1 of tranche 1 may be done within the 90-day period. So let's see how that plays out. So far, the focus is on goods. Services sector is not being touched. Mobility issues are not being touched. They'll be handled later. But even if that is done, there would be a positive segment related. But again, there is a contradiction. The joint statement says that, and I think Anil, you also referred to that trade will be taken from the present $200 billion to $500 billion by 2030. But if you can't do that, if you're at the same time telling Apple, don't expand production in India, because ultimately the whole purpose is to do more production in India, which can be exported to the US and also buy more from the US. Otherwise, how do you take trade to $500 billion? And at a time when you said that Apple shouldn't do more production in India, US had just done a deal with the UAE for the tech companies in the US to invest heavily in data centers in the UAE for artificial intelligence. So it's a different set of policies being followed in different contexts, and ultimately India will have to leverage its strength. So given all this, in terms of looking ahead, clearly the option for India would be, one, you have to strengthen yourself. Because at a moment of crisis, you have to deal with your challenges on your own. You cannot build your strategy based on support that may be available at that stage from anywhere. You have to deal with it yourself, but before that, you leverage your various partnerships to build your strength. And so at the current moment, clearly sustain the relationship with Russia, keep deepening it, because you need to make sure that Russia doesn't go over to China on India-China issues. You build your relationship with different segments, because no other country really has the capacity economically or technologically to be supportive of the kind of aspirations that India and Indian society has for its economic and technological growth. You can't find that in any country in Europe. Even other partners like Japan, Australia, several of the European countries look at what the United States is doing with India to be able to do more. The moment we did the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, the ISET, with the United States, the British came to India and said, we want to do a similar agreement with you. And after that, with the UK, India has done something called TSI, Technology Security Initiative, which is really a cut and paste of the ISET initiative. So other countries who are partners of the US will be willing to do more with India if the US is doing more. So that's a point that we can leverage. So I think it's that framework that broadly we have to work out our strategic choices?
Thank you. I think what I'm going to do is take advantage to give you a very short military perspective and then ask the three panelists one question, which will be on China. You know, for some time now, it's become fashionable to say that conventional war is passé and that it will not take place or it will be stopped by other powers very shortly. I think the most important shift I have seen in various interactions that I've had in the last week is finally what the military has been saying for a while. You can talk all you want, but you need a big stick. And you have to strengthen yourself. And it's all about capability, capability, and capability. And now that the nuclear bogey has been called, we better get armed conventionally, not with respect to Pakistan, but with respect to the role that we want to play in the world. It's an expensive business, the military, and there are too many people who, as they say, know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And we have to figure out how much we really can do in this regard. And of course, conventional war is something we have to be prepared for on many fronts. And China being a bogey is not just a bogey, but a possibility. So my question to the panelists, it's pretty easy to answer stuff on the US and on Russia. But on China, as you all know, we are heavily involved economically. There is an enormous amount of trade with China. There are a lot of Chinese companies, Chinese supplies, and vice versa. And we all at the same time realize that this is a long-term adversary whose impact could be negative in many ways. So this conundrum of decoupling from China or handling China in this new environment that we are faced with. I'd like to hear your comments and before I open it up to the audience on China. And what do you think should be our stance because of the economic interlinkages?
So, just a couple of things. One, as we have recognized since, as we have recognized overtly since Prime Minister Vajpayee wrote to President Bill Clinton back in 1998 that the reason for the nuclear tests was actually China. President Clinton leaked that letter to the New York Times, which is how we all know about it. I don't think that recognition has changed. In fact, it has sharpened. If you look at the relationship today, there is a very clear understanding inside India, and it has been so for the last 15 years at least, that China will resist India's rise in every which way it can. Its easiest tool is Pakistan. It will continue to use Pakistan to keep India off kilter, and that's one of the ways it will. The second way, and when we talk about economic linkages, we have to be very clear what that means. The trading relationship between, or the economic relationship between India and China is completely skewed. You have a trade deficit of over $100 billion, largely because you don't export, because there is no market access in China. It is completely an Indian import story. It is not a trade story. It is an import story, and that is fundamentally dysfunctional. It is because of this dysfunctionality, which was actually aided by the rest of the world ever since China joined the WTO, because China used its state-owned enterprises, its subsidies, to be actually producing everything so cheaply that it made much more sense for everybody in the world to just outsource everything to China. But COVID came in. The pandemic showed countries like India that China was weaponizing its exports. that it created the vulnerabilities for certainly countries like India, even countries like the US and other parts of the world. But from our perspective, from pharmaceuticals to medical devices to what have you, we found ourselves incredibly vulnerable to Chinese being able to turn off the taps as they did. And therefore, that cycle started of being able to indigenize production, of being able to reshore, friendshore, and we have lived with this the whole idea of diversifying away from China because was a strategic choice made by certain parts of the world like India, like the US, like the Quad. That choice has not changed, but the current US administration's move to do a trade deal with China puts a new layer of complexity into this particular matrix. So, as Ambassador Singh talked about, when Apple moved its production from China to India, it was almost tectonic shift. If the president is now telling Apple, move away from India, that you'd get out of friendshoring and move back to America, which is going to be very, very hard for Apple to do. We are going to be seeing a new level of disturbance. So how do we deal with China? And I think we have to deal with China in a reverse way of how China deals with us. China will never stabilize your border, because that keeps you again off balance. You have a 4,000 kilometer border which is not demarcated. To be able to build capability to deter a future Galwan. But on the other hand, you have to be able to increase costs on Pakistan over and over again, because that bleeds China. And you have to impose costs on China via Pakistan. We have always believed that if we leave Pakistan alone and only concentrate on China, you cannot deal with the two of them as disparate entities. In so many different ways, Pakistan has become a subset of your China policy. And therefore, you have to take those difficult choices of imposing costs on Pakistan. Pakistan may be irrelevant, it is 1/11th your size, but an act like a Pahalgam, an act like a Mumbai throws everything off gear. So, there has to be a security response to this rather than only an economic response.
Professor, China?
Well, I think I'd be a very rich man if I had the answer, but I do think that ultimately there are only two ways of dealing with China. I mean, under the present circumstances, either we continue. And both should run parallelly, and both entail building your own capacity. So again, economic growth is very important. I think everything else falls aside. If your economy is not doing very well, you don't have resources to manage China in multiple ways, and you don't therefore also become attractive to others. So I think focusing laser-like on domestic economic growth certainly has to be important, and I think that's why there has been a lot of focus on, for example, in the social media debate around Operation Sindoor, right? Why did we not go further? I think that misses the point. Ultimately, what's a nation's strategic objective? And the strategic objective being the economic growth and economic development means that in some ways that has been our answer to China for a while, and that should continue to be our answer. But I think as Ambassador Singh mentioned, leveraging partnerships. How can we leverage our partnerships? Because they help us in two ways. They help us in our economic growth, in shaping our economic growth paradigm, but also in helping in key areas where perhaps we don't have capacity for our own security. So there you have the US as an important partner, Europe as an important partner, many countries that provide niche capabilities to you, which allow you to shape the security architecture vis-a-vis China. So I think that's the only option available to us in the short to medium term in terms of responding to the challenge that China poses. This is not unique to India, this is unique to the world, and I think economically the challenge that China poses is also, we are seeing a pushback from a number of other countries, which I think is a good thing. We should be partnering and looking at leveraging those partnerships towards the goal.
So briefly, yeah.
So very briefly, just 3 points. One, I think in itself, there's no harm in having an economic and commercial relationship, but certain things we need to do. Some dependencies must be broken. So if you look at the pharmaceutical sector, APIs, starting materials, intermediates, there is a certain concentration in China. Now you don't want that kind of dependence, so that needs to be some alternative found related to that. Or in terms of critical minerals, which are very important for electronics, for batteries, again China dominates in refining, in processing, so that kind of dependence needs to be. And the final thing is that in the US-China competition, and I don't rule out that US will do a trade deal with China, but the US is not saying that whatever it works out with China, it is prepared to be number 2 in the world. It still wants to be number 1 in the world. And US has absorbed that if it wants to retain its technological lead vis-a-vis China, it needs the India partnership. You know, today you have 1800 global capability centers in India doing cutting edge R&D and technology development work for global multinationals servicing their global operations. You know, some of the leading semiconductor companies in the US are employing 17,000 people in India doing cutting edge R&D and technology work. One of the leading jet engine companies, and we don't have so far jet engine technology, they have 8,000 people just in Bengaluru doing cutting edge R&D and technology development work. 20% of the global talent in semiconductor design is based in India. So there are certain strengths that we have, and we must leverage those strengths to be part of the technology game so that we build certain capacities to handle the China challenge.
Thank you. I think we can wind up this by just saying that this whole business of peace through strength and deterrence is something which most of us have now recognized. And I would agree with the professor that we need to continue building economic power, without which there is no military power. And we leverage people for technology because we don't have adequate technology in new areas like directed energy, weapons which are coming about. Anyway, I'll stop here. Let's have questions from the audience. Let's start from this side.
Good afternoon, I'm Ratan Keswani. 2 questions actually, and one to Ambassador. You know, we keep talking about US and China. Why has UK always played a role tilting towards Pakistan, more or less, in multiple things? And a question to you, Ms. Bagchi, is there is, you know, hatred towards certain politicians or policies or parties seem to define a lot of liberal media reactions. And that media is followed by a lot of the, let's say, older, more mature generations, who then listen to their point of view, which, as you all articulate, should be followed, but they seem to dislike it or tell people or predict it, it won't happen that way. Why is this imbalance? Purely because of a visceral dislike to a human being, to a political party. So UK to you, and more from a press point of view to yourself. Thank you.
So on the UK question, way back in 1947-48, when the Jammu and Kashmir issue was taken to the UN, at that time the US came out in support of India and said aggression has happened, this is a post-Second World War world, aggression cannot be accepted, India must be supported. And now the, the declassified archives show that the British went all over the world, including to the US, the State Department, the Presidency, saying please change your position. We must help Pakistan. Pakistan is much smaller than India. It will always remain dependent on us. It will give us military bases. The Indians are too big. They are too independent minded. See what they have done to us. They are decolonizing the world. They have thrown us out. So we must take a position to support Pakistan. So they have always felt that in the India-Pakistan dimension, Pakistan will be much more pliable as far as UK or the broader Western interests are concerned than India would be. And that's how Pakistan also joined the military alliance system led by the United States. So that was one reason historically on India-Pakistan issues they have supported Pakistan. The second reason has been that when terrorism became an issue, they feel that much of the terrorism which could be a challenge in the UK has its origin in the Pakistan-Afghanistan region. So for counter-terrorism cooperation, they need cooperation with Pakistan. So that's one reason they want to engage with them. Third thing that has happened is that the Indian origin diaspora in the UK is larger than the Pakistan origin diaspora, but the Pakistan origin diaspora is concentrated in certain constituencies and therefore has a larger sort of impact on the electoral outcome than the Indian origin diaspora so far. And so many of the members in the UK Parliament are responsive to that. So I think these are among the factors so far that had slightly tilted UK approach towards Pakistan on India-Pakistan issues, but I understand that that is now changing because India's economic heft today is much larger than that of Pakistan. So gradually it is changing. The technology partnership I spoke about, the technology security initiative they have done, they're trying to advance that. And UK and India have now done a free trade agreement, the first one that India has done recently. So these are indicators of the future. So I do believe they're gradually moving away from that.
Well, regarding the media, if you ask people in the liberal end of the spectrum, they'd say that the entire airwaves are have been taken over by the conservative or the Modi-leaning media, and you know, this is a contestation that has been there forever. Frankly, if you look around the world, you can see this particular contestation everywhere in the US, in the UK, in parts of Europe. You just have to figure out who to believe and why you would believe that. But even if you weren't politically inclined, the age of social media means that you are bombarded with disinformation and fake news. Getting beyond that or being able to see beyond that, I think societies around the world are only beginning to learn to live with it.
Okay, sure. Right. Sanjeev at the back, then I'll come to the Sanjeev in the front.
At the outset, thank you very much to all panelists for an illuminating, insightful perspective. I have two questions for you to consider. One may appear very naive at this stage. What is your view on starting people-to-people contact with Pakistan? Second question, specifically if I may ask Professor Pant for his views, there seems to be a strong enough case for us to broaden our allies' base, given the uncertainty of our major allies in terms of their behavior. Thank you.
Well, as part of an institution that has done that has been vilified over the years for starting people-to-people conversations with Pakistan, I think we've been there, done that, both at the government level and at the private sector level. In my previous newspaper, The Times of India, we started an initiative called the Aman Ki Asha. After we had exhausted the musicians and the chefs and the actors, that was the end, because they didn't want to go forward without Kashmir being resolved, and no matter what you do, you always end up over there. So nobody wanted to do their business, nobody wanted to trade until Kashmir was resolved. So that's where it ended.
So if I can just make a, so when in around 2000 to 2005, when I was Joint Secretary, I was handling our relations with Pakistan. At that time, people like Indrani used to berate us day in and day out. Please expand people-to-people relationship, that will make a difference. And now what has happened is that people in that segment of society have become much more hawkish and don't want any people-to-people interaction. So even more hawkish than the government at times. So that's one. The second thing I'd mention just as an example, in fact, there's now a Netflix series also on that the Indian, after the Prime Minister Vajpayee met President Musharraf in January 2004, a new phase started in the India-Pakistan relationship. A decision was taken to allow the Indian cricket team to go to Pakistan. And the Indian cricket team went to Pakistan in 2004. Very successful visit, successful tour. People wouldn't charge, a lot of people were given visas to go from India. And people wouldn't charge them in restaurants for the food, taxi drivers would charge money, and general sense of bonhomie because it was emerging after a period of tension. After that, the Pakistani team was invited to come to India, and then as a reciprocal gesture under some political pressure, we gave large number of visas to Pakistanis to come to India. So they came. After the matches, they all went back except 14, and those 14 were responsible for terrorist incidents in India later.
Correct.
So, people has its challenges.
Professor, you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think just very briefly on this people-to-people thing, I think it also has to be reciprocal. And I think Javed Akhtar made a very interesting point recently, saying that, look, we keep on inviting Pakistani artists, but even Lata Mangeshkar was never invited to Pakistan. So, I mean, the sense that you cannot have, it can't be India's responsibility to generate a goodwill in the relationship only. I mean, we are the bigger country, of course, but it has to be reciprocal. That's the whole idea of people-to-people relationship. But I think on allies, that's an excellent point, and I think if you look at the relationships that India has generated over the last few decades, there is an expansion of India's worldview. I think one particular geography you see India doing very well, which is the Gulf, where India's relationships, which used to be the other way around, Saudis and UAE always supportive of Pakistan, today have turned around completely, almost completely, and very significant investments being made here in this country. So I think there are critical geographies where India's relationships have expanded, and I think that is perhaps also a reflection of India's economic might and economic prowess, that countries are attracted to India as a partner.
Yeah, Sanjeev.
Do you think at some stage there has to be a paradigm shift, and this following of the United States, where an insane Republican president comes, and when the Democrat comes, there's the deep state. So even though incrementally our relationships may be going up, there's always a problem with the United States. Two ancient civilizations next to each other. Should there not be a Nixon moment where we get together with China and do something to further our two causes rather than depending on the United States? And as a corollary to that, we now have a new bordello on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue where the occupant is available for sale. If Qatar, who always ran with the hare and hunted with the hound, can buy him for $400 million, why can't we buy him? I mean, he's a transactional guy. I have nothing else. In a lighter moment, maybe we can give him the Kohinoor. He'll take it out of the Tower of London. We don't have it in any case.
Well, I'm sure others will comment, but let me just say that Chanakya said that your neighbor is a problem. And
your
so,
neighbor's neighbor is
and neighbor's neighbor, so that neighbor's neighbor across the Pacific can be helpful. So you have to keep that in mind. So look, I think with China we've been trying to do what you have suggested since the 1950s. And obviously for various reasons it's not worked, and from the Indian perception is because China takes certain unilateral assertive postures, keeping in mind just its own interests, and does not want to accommodate India's concerns and interests. So, given that you have no option but to build other partnerships, it's just that one important partner of yours is a very complex partner. Its decision making is complex, there is unpredictability, but you have to work your way through that. And you've built a very strong relationship in trade, technology and other areas despite these complexities. So, you have to show nimble footwork, but there is no alternative that you have.
Just very briefly on this question, this also is, you also have to look at it perhaps from the other side, that many Americans also find India to be a very difficult partner. So, India's very complex democracy, multiple coalitions at one point in time working. So, it's both ways. I think there used to be this sense that, look, India pontificates a lot. We talk in straight language, they tell us the theory behind, the philosophy behind how the world should work. So, I think there are challenges on both sides, and it is not simply that we find them difficult, they also find us equally difficult, and that's how the world works. I think all countries have their own problems with their
So,
friends.
the other thing is, China is not our partner. China doesn't even consider us to be their partner. China has sort of looked at us as an adversary since the day the Dalai Lama landed in India. That has not changed. There is no universe in which Indian and Chinese interests would converge to the extent that we would not need a partner to balance China.
Okay, one last question maybe. Okay, ma'am.
Okay, hello, my name is Kar to the panel. I have grown up in Indian foreign service background. So I have lived in Pakistan also, and China, and almost so many countries. So I have few questions. I work with plants, so I can say आप जड़ मजबूत नहीं करेंगे तो आपकी branches पत्ते कब आएंगे. Nobody has talked about what's gone wrong with the word civilization. Aren't we going to redefine it? Is there going to be a world mechanism or a body for smooth trade, economics and existence all over again? For so many years, after 2 world wars and so many undefined wars, we have had so many beautiful organizations like UN and NATO and BRICS and Quad and Davos and climate G10, whatever. What have we achieved? The one-upmanship still exists. Destructions have not stopped by whosoever has some supremacy, and otherwise too, it's a free for all. So what is my question now is, so what is the future of Earth vis-a-vis humans? 3, 4 interrelated questions, please. Thank you.
Anyone wants to take that on?
Well, all I can say is based on my experience, power and competition is an inevitable part of human existence. And in fact, we keep saying that every now and then there are wars interrupting peace. Some philosophers said that if you look at human history, it's period of continuous conflict interrupted by periods of peace. So, human beings are competitive. Unfortunately, they are not able to always organize themselves to deal with their differences in a framework of peace. So, we keep having conflict from time to time. So, competition, conflict so far are an essential part of human existence.
Thank you.
I think we leave it at that. Yes. We can continue discussions outside at lunch. All that remains for me is to ask you to join me in giving them a good hand.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Indrani, Professor Pant, Ambassador Singh, and Admiral Chopra for that really engaging conversation. I think we'll sum it up that the India way, especially now, would be more of a sharper or decider rather than be an abstainer. So thank you so much. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, after that food for thought, it's time for lunch, nostalgia, networking.